Welcome back to the School of Muscle. Today, Dorian joins me to discuss a recent study that he was an author on regarding caffeine, and I'll make sure to have that study linked in the description so you guys can go kind of check it out if you want to kind of review the full study or anything like that. But I think a good place for us to start here, Dorian, is just first off, what kind of made you want to do this study in the first place?
So, hi everyone. Thanks, Ryan, for having me on. It's a pleasure. Well, caffeine is always an interesting topic to study. In the last decade, there's really been a plethora of new research on the topic regarding various types of activities, so sports and the resistance exercise, etc. So we did this meta back in November last year, I think. So just right after I finished up with my master's degree in kinesiology, I co-authored the paper with Jozo Grgic. He was the lead author. He is one of the top minds in the field. So if you've ever come across the caffeine or resistance exercise paper, along with that, Dr. Brad Schoenfeld, he was probably on one of those.
I've been trying to get him on the pod.
Yeah, he's right now got a lot going on for him, but still, I think he'd be open to it.
Awesome.
Well, so for what made us actually do the study, so mostly for me personally, I'd say most of the time when it comes to like generating hypotheses, ideas, etc., it mostly stems from reading paper. And so we've published one other meta-analysis on caffeine and ballistic exercise, so throwing in particular. And I'd say we were in a pretty good groove at the time for like collabing and writing the papers. And we've noticed that in sports science research, there's a minority of female participants. So that's like a trend. And it's no different actually when it comes to supplements, so caffeine, creatine, etc. So it's always interesting to see if there are some potential meaningful differences between the males and females and how they respond to different supplements. Because, for example, females might metabolize caffeine differently according to the phase of the menstrual cycle. So we can consider that a potential moderator variable. So he also co-authored a recent paper that focused explicitly on females in resistance exercise. However, we were also interested in other aspects of performance, so jumping in particular. So jumping performance is often measured in lab settings for, after plyometrics, for example, some intervention including plyometrics, or for measuring the power output of, let's say, quads. So that's really important for sports like basketball, volleyball, etc. So we thought it would actually be both important and interesting from a practical standpoint to see with this new available body of evidence, because there's been quite a lot new studies on the topic in the last 2 years, I'd say, how caffeine impacts jumping performance in females specifically, and how much, if they do, these moderator variables actually impact those ergogenic effects.
Awesome. And did you have any particular kind of expectations heading into the study? I know you mentioned there has been, a bit more research on kind of around this topic the last handful of years. So did that kind of lead you to a certain hypothesis on what you guys thought was going to happen, or what were you kind of expecting heading into this?
So for the most part, personally, I'd say I was expecting caffeine to be ergogenic for jumping performance, just as like with the other variables, such as everything from strength, muscular endurance, etc., for resistance exercise. So that would put us in a ballpark of small to medium effect sizes ranging from, 0.3, something like that, which has been the case for most of the studies. However, I was also interested to see how much would some moderator variables actually influence the results, for example, phase of the menstrual cycle, or the dose over, time of day.
And how did you guys kind of decide to set this study up? What were kind of your methods, and what did participants do, and what were you kind of looking at here?
In a meta-analysis, there's a bunch of different models that you can use for defining like the inclusion criteria. We use the one called PICO, so the acronym stands for Population, Intervention, Comparison, and the Outcome. So we would include studies that had participants with double-blinded or triple-blinded in a crossover design. So meaning they performed both the placebo condition and the the experimental condition, so ingesting caffeine. That focused solely on female participants, or perhaps if they had mixed sex, so both males and females, the authors had to have the data available for female participants only, so we can extract those. And we also saw for the comparison, they had to have, of course, the placebo condition, and for the outcomes was just plain simple vertical jump height.
Gotcha. So you're looking at just females ingesting caffeine and looking at vertical jump height for performance.
Yeah.
And what were you guys? Did you have a certain like dose of caffeine that you were looking at, or was it just like studies that included caffeine, and then in your guys' results, you guys kind of teased out the kind of magnitude effect based on how much caffeine they had? Is that correct?
Yeah. So we had them because we did moderate the dose. So we've split the dose for the like less than 3 milligrams per kilo, which is somewhat of a standard dose, and more than 3 milligrams per kilo. So that would be considered like low doses and higher doses. So we found that actually 15 studies fit in total in the inclusion criteria, and that would amount to roughly about 200 participants, female participants. So that gave us actually a decent size sample size to draw some inferences.
Awesome. Well, I think with that set up, it's time to get to the good stuff. What did you guys kind of find here? What were maybe some of the interesting results here?
So as you would expect, and as I maybe alluded to earlier, our main findings were that caffeine actually improves vertical jumping performance in females as well as the males, with the magnitude effects being considered small, but typical, as I've said, for what is seen with this supplement. So I think it was around 0.3, maybe 0.28 or 2.3, something like that. I'd have to look it up. I'd note that there was one meta-analysis prior to ours on the same topic, but I'd say they were somewhat limited by that they only included female athlete participants, so not the ones. We've also included the participants that were resistance trained. Some of them at least were resistance trained, some were recreationally trained, and they also included studies, I believe, that used energy drinks, which is somewhat confounding variable in my opinion, because energy drinks do not have isolated caffeine in themselves, so they have taurine and some other substances that may or may not actually influence the results. So we've only focused on studies that did the isolated caffeine ingestion. So as I've mentioned earlier, we also wanted to explore these potential moderator variables. So we've performed several of subgroup analysis for each of those. So we split them up in the phase of the menstrual cycle. We split them up into dose, being less or more than 3 milligrams per kilo. We split them up in the time of day of testing. So was the testing done in the morning, in the afternoon, or some mix where some studies indeed both? And we did the test type. So we had the counter movement jump and squat jump. So I can briefly go over each of those if you'd like.
Yep, that'd be perfect.
Sure. So broadly speaking, menstrual cycle phase can be divided into follicular phase, the ovulatory phase or ovulation, and the luteal phase. Some early data from around start of the 90s, I think it's been well over 20 years now, has shown that caffeine's clearance may actually differ between the follicular and the luteal phase, with luteal showing actually some slower caffeine elimination. So that's actually might have something to do with the circulating changes in hormone levels that go on throughout the cycle. But there is also some other evidence on the contrary side that suggests that pharmacokinetics of the caffeine might actually be unaffected by the menstrual cycle. So at best, in my opinion, I don't know. At this stage, I'd say we're not sure for now. I think we still need a lot more data on the topic. But in general, we found for follicular phase, we actually found a moderate effect size of 0.5. So that's a bit larger than what you've typically seen, maybe a twofold increase, actually. But I'd mentioned that we had only, I think, 3 or 4 studies for most of these subgroup analysis, so much higher, larger, I'd say, a wider confidence interval. So that precludes us the ability to maybe make some strong suggestions and conclusions. So indicating more data is needed before we can jump on a train and say, yeah, if you want to improve your performance, take caffeine then. But I'd also briefly mention there was a notion about, I don't know if you've read the paper recently, about women programming their training according to the phase of menstrual cycle, and that there seems to be a potential greater drop in performance in the early follicular phase. And in this paper, we've discussed some potential physiological changes that would occur, such as the drop in involuntary activation and etc. And if that actually does occur, caffeine would potentially be able to influence the voluntary activation, and perhaps that's why the effects were greater in the follicular phase than in the luteal phase. So that paper that was authored by Lawrence Sample, I think. I think it's Lawrence Sample. So they actually found and discussed that some physiological changes, such as the acute drop in hormone levels, do not perhaps attenuate performance, such as drop in strength. But so that's something to keep in mind. Even though this review focused solely on resistance training and not jumping performance, it might hold here true as well. So I don't know, it may have something to do with women during their period experiencing greater symptoms, and the higher RPE session. So perhaps intaking caffeine on those days might help alleviate those symptoms, or because acutely caffeine can cause a drop in rate of perceived exertion, and so there's a possible if.
That would definitely make sense to me, and seems like a fairly strong theoretical hypothesis anyways for why caffeine might make more sense in those certain phases. But as you said, with a lot of things in exercise science, more data would definitely be beneficial on kind of supporting that a bit more. So awesome. And for some of those other moderators, did you want to kind of continue on what else you found here?
For the dose, we actually found similar effects with lower doses and higher doses. So everything less than 3 milligrams and everything higher than 3 milligrams. So consuming somewhat of a standard dose of 3 milligrams, I think puts you in the right ballpark most of the time. But I'd also mention, for anyone curious, that EOS did publish recently a meta-analysis on consuming low caffeine doses. So I think it was 0.9, and 1 milligram and 2 milligram per kilo. And those doses seem to be equally effective as the more typical ones. However, with the higher ones, even though they might produce similar effects, there's also a risk of higher incidence of side effects. So that's something worth keeping in mind, in my opinion.
Yeah, and just to kind of pause on this one a little bit, to where this was actually one of the kind of more interesting takeaways for me, is that there seem to be positive effects with even relatively smaller doses of caffeine, in which I know there's been previous literature in which they're looking at 6 milligrams of caffeine per kilo. And when I think about that, it's I'm just under 100 kilos. So if I'm looking at 6 milligrams of caffeine, it's like, man, if I popped 600 milligrams of caffeine, I would be anxious, and my heart would start having convulsions and stuff, and it would not be good. It would impact my sleep as well. So it's definitely cool to me to see anyways that hey, I don't need to have so much caffeine to still have a positive effect. To me, it sounds like even downwards of 1 milligram per kilo might be enough to provide, a lot of the benefits. Then you might get diminishing returns from there. Does that sound pretty fair?
Yeah, I'd say so. Just a quick side note. Imagine taking the original Jack 3D formula with the 6 milligram.
Oh my God.
You'd be bust out of your mind.
Dude, I have a hard enough time with if I have more than 1 or 2 cups of coffee, and usually I think a cup of coffee is 80 to 100 milligrams of caffeine
something
per
like
cup,
that.
I think. So it can definitely vary pretty significantly between like how you prepared and stuff like that. So definitely have to be a little bit careful of that. But man, more than like 100 to 150 milligrams in a single sitting for me is like too much. So that would be a lot.
That's mostly so 1 to 2 milligrams actually puts you right around average like size monster, I think. So that's around 150 to 170, I think. Or 1 to 2 cups of coffee, as I said. So yeah, low doses actually for those who are maybe not accustomed to caffeine might be just right starting point. Following on for the time of day, so the AM or PM sessions, some research has indicated that some participants may actually perform better in the evenings hours, just because of the body temperature reaching like peak core levels, and so that would possibly maximize the actin-myosin cross-bridging, which is really important for force production. However, we found actually no differences between the AM or PM sessions. However, there was a trend for like higher effect sizes in the morning, but ultimately no differences. And I believe it was only 2 or 3 studies in that particular subgroup. So there's like need more studies on that. I don't honestly remember, because it's been a while, if those studies actually ask for preferred time to train of those participants. So I think it possibly would be interesting to see if changing the preferred time to train from, let's say, from PM to AM would, in somewhat physiological, psychological more sense manner, influence the effects of caffeine. Would those effects actually be greater because of increased like motivation and increase blood pressure, heart rate, just more feeling of the wakefulness?
That would definitely make sense to me, as I think there's also research on when people switch from training in the afternoon to the morning, there's like at least a few week period in which it takes them to kind of get used to training at that time, and then their kind of performance comes back to baseline after a few weeks there. So it'd be interesting to see if like, can caffeine kind of modulate that effect a little bit, in which, you know, if you then supplement with caffeine when you transition to training in the morning, maybe that would prevent some of that performance loss. But as you said, there was like maybe a slight trend here, but not enough data, not enough studies to really point towards that kind of finding there.
Yeah, that's called the neuromuscular deficit or something like that. I think these ordos did cover this in mass, but I'd say it's 5 to 10% drop, and it goes back to baseline in around 4 to 5 weeks, I think. And for the last one, we did the test type. So that was either they did counter movement jump or they did the squat jump. So when talking jumping performance, there's a bunch of actually different tests that you can do. So there's the horizontal jumps, and there's the vertical type tests. And those are often used, as I mentioned, for example, for assessing force and power output. And maybe the more prevalent ones in the research and actually in the field, are both the counter movement jump and the squat jump. So for those that are perhaps not familiar with the differences between the two, counter movement jump uses something called the stretch shortening cycle. So that would mean performing a rapid eccentric followed by a rapid concentric phase. So you would squat down fast and then explode up. That has been shown to performing the eccentric phase lets the agonist muscles generate significant force. Also gives enough time to the structures, so the tendons, to build up slack and to build up the elastic energy, which all of this influence the power output of the quads, propelling you up in the concentric phase, and actually resulting with you in general jumping a bit higher with the counter movement, as opposed to the squat jump, where you would just squat down from a fixed hip flexion angle without the first eccentric phase. So we actually found no differences between the both tests. So caffeine seems to be equally effective in improving both the counter movement jump and both the squat jump performance. I'd note that vertical jumps, and we've also made the same statement in the discussion, where the jump tests are often measured on the force platforms. So that also allows you to measure other variables such as rate of force development, power, velocity, etc. So I think analyzing at least some of those variables is something that's can be potentially useful, especially for coaches and athletes in sports. For example, I've seen this personally with a recent sodium bicarbonate paper that we've published. We were analyzing both the total number of repetitions in the bench press to failure, but also the power output and the velocity output. And let's say you find no differences between the bicarbonate and placebo for the total number of repetitions, but you found differences in the, I'd say, velocity output. That if you didn't measure those, you would quite possibly conclude that sodium bicarbonate seems to not improve the performance in the bench press repetitions or muscular endurance. But having those variables available to you, data available to you, might be of helpful insight and guide in training practices and for someone interested in also increasing those.
Absolutely. And with kind of your results here, a lot of these seem pretty in line with what I was kind of expecting. Is that also kind of true for you, or did any of these results particularly surprise you, or how are you kind of feeling overall about your results compared to maybe some other research that's out there?
For the most part, no. So I'd say they were pretty in line with what we've thought, with what we've seen in the literature. But perhaps the cycle phase, the magnitude of those effects was a bit higher than expected for the follicular phase in comparison to the luteal phase. So maybe those, but again, those weren't such huge differences in magnitude of effect to make me be just like that quite surprised. I'd be more surprised if we had more studies on the topic because I might be more confident in those results.
And for a lot of research with caffeine, a lot of it is kind of related to someone's performance in more kind of like athletic pursuits. And if someone's listening to this, school muscle, they're probably interested more in resistance training, lifting weights, trying to get jacked, all that stuff. So how do you think, and this might, be not necessarily in line with your study, but maybe based on some of your other research on this topic and stuff, how do you think that some of this applies to someone just looking to gain as much muscle as they can? And, does a lot of this still apply? Is caffeine maybe still beneficial, or what do you kind of think about that?
So even though this meta-analysis is actually focused on a really specific population and outcomes, I suspect that jumping performance might not be a focus of a regular gym bro and lifter, but I would say that the findings are, as I've said, mostly in line with what we've also seen for resistance exercise. So I think some practical applications would actually stand both true in both scenarios, I suspect. So in particular for those, running anywhere from 3 to 6 milligrams seems to be enough to elicit ergogenic effects, but also potentially even lower than that. So 1 milligram, 2 milligram doses seems to work just as fine in most cases. And with the higher doses actually just eliciting greater side effects. So perhaps that might not be a recommendation I'd give. There hasn't been a recent dose response study for the caffeine. So, but mostly it is well accepted that the caffeine does not have the dose response effect. For the time of day, I actually don't believe we have enough studies in resistance training or some power outcomes and strength just yet. I do believe there are a few for endurance performance, but I think if they use mouthwashing with caffeine, and at best, that method is questionable. None of those, I think, ever tested the plasma levels of caffeine, so it's questionable if it even works, or is it just placebo-driven. And for the phase of menstrual cycle, I also think there are some conflicting results regarding that. There was one study from Santana et al., I believe it is, that found greater effects in the follicular phase as well as we did. So that perhaps might be some indication that there actually is a greater effect in the follicular phase as opposed to the other, but I'd say that we still need a lot more new studies on the topic before we can be just a bit more sure.
Yep, and I would say I'll kind of give what I usually give as my general recommendations to clients for caffeine intake, and then you could, say if you have any critiques of this, but usually I say that if caffeine intake doesn't impede your sleep, so I think that's a big thing to consider, as well as like if you're lifting weights maybe after work, so maybe 5 or 6 p.m. and that's, if you go to bed at 10 p.m., that's probably within about 5 hours of sleep there. You definitely need to be kind of careful of that, in which I believe the half-life of caffeine is 6-ish hours or something. So
6 to 8, yeah.
Gotcha. So, if you have 600 milligrams of caffeine at 5 p.m., you'll probably still have quite a bit in your system when you're trying to go to bed, and that could definitely impact things. And I know people have varying degrees of like speed of metabolism of caffeine and stuff like that, and they can be kind of more or less sensitive to it. So I know for some clients, if they have it too late, it definitely impacts things. So generally, I recommend, having anywhere from kind of that 2 to 4 milligrams of caffeine, roughly 60-ish minutes before training. And as long as they kind of make sure that it's not impacting sleep, then it can kind of benefit performance, but still make sure to pay attention to how you're responding with it. And now with some of this kind of more recent research, maybe even getting away with the lower end, like 1 milligram of caffeine per kilo is kind of also a good idea there. Does that, seem kind of reasonable there?
Yeah, to me, that's a perfectly good recommendation, I'd say, because I'd say people actually ingest caffeine more than they realize, maybe subconsciously, because I've heard instances of like, I can drink coffee before sleep and it doesn't affect me. Does it really? Maybe you're sleeping. You feel like you're sleeping, but what's the quality of the sleep? And over the long term, that can result in a much. That can actually result significantly in a loss of performance in the gym, and then they're also looking. And the worst thing is they resolve to even more caffeine.
Yep. It's like the negative cycle of you have caffeine, it impacts sleep, so you wake up the next day tired, so you have more caffeine, and then it impacts sleep even more, and then you have even more caffeine, and then it's like this negative hell loop of just having more and more caffeine and never actually benefiting that much from it. And like we said, there doesn't seem to be like a dose response relationship to where like more is better. So with caffeine, if you can get away, and research suggests that you probably can get away with a little bit lower doses, and you don't have to keep continuously upping that kind of dose as you go. So is there anything else that you wanted to touch on, any kind of final takeaways or anything else regarding kind of your research or this topic for kind of people to go away with?
I think we've mostly covered it all, in my opinion. I'd say just don't go overboard with caffeine. Try it out. If you seem to enjoy your cup of coffee, do so.
Yep, absolutely. So if people want to stay up to date with the research you're doing and other things that you have coming out, is there anywhere that they can go online to make sure they're following your stuff?
Yeah, so for research in particular, we're just now getting ready to start data collection for a review paper with Milo and Brad Schoenfeld on some longer muscle length training. So that's going to be interesting. And that's also going to be a part of my PhD. But they can also always look me up on ResearchGate. So it's Dorian Varovic. It's kind of hard to pronounce in English.
I'll have your name linked in the description and stuff. So. And
I don't know if Instagram has the translate option for native speaking English speakers, but there's my profile, trainology.hr. Cool. So yeah, I mostly write in Croatian, but I'm thinking of doing the switch just because of the collabs and everything. I think it would be useful.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for coming on today. I definitely learned a lot, and I'm sure the audience feels the same. So I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.